And he can't believe it. And look at Hikaru. He's cool as a cucumber. He is focused, and he's acting like nothing just happened, but something huge happened. He gained the lead. It's the first lead in this match, and it belongs to Hikaru Nakamura.
And that final position, I think the reason Magnus flagged is because he recognized that the white king was going to move into the queen side. I think he may have forgotten that the bishop from b6 could attack h4, but it's a moot point now. Magnus panics, and this is a very concerning sign for him in the early going because, Robert, one thing I know for a fact about this match is that we're going to get a heck of a lot of time scrambles.
We're going to get a heck of a lot of time scrambles. We're going to get a heck of a lot of viewers. We are over 125,000 viewers right now. Thank you so much for tuning in. Your day is just getting started. You had the World Cup final. Now you have the Speed Chess Championship final, and it is exciting. Hikaru Nakamura with a 2-1 lead. He's looking to the side like he does, vintage Hikaru, trying to figure out this position. And Magnus with the white side, the Catalan. Danya, I think it's a good opening choice in a blitz match.
And it's a good opening choice after a loss. You're sort of stabilizing. You're playing something on the safer side, something that you're comfortable with. And, man, facing Magnus on the black side of a Catalan, I know of few more appetizing prospects. Maybe facing a penalty kick from Lionel Messi. That's right about comparable.
Yeah, that was not very fun, right? Lionel Messi scoring for Argentina multiple times today, leading them to victory. Congratulations to all of Argentina. But right now we're focused on the chess. And what I'm focused on, Danya, is the activity of white's pieces and the relative passivity of black's. Now, black controls the b4 square, just like in that previous game. That is an important one to keep in mind. And the knight goes to d7, often they go to b6, maybe to d5. When you have less space, you have less control. You want to exchange pieces. If the knight on d7 is exchanged for the knight on c3, that gives black control of the e4 square. And you don't want to see white push e2 to e4. Right now it's covered by both bishop on c6 and knight on f6. But if white could play rook fe1 and pawn e4 in one move, then white would have the advantage.
Great insight and explanation. In these types of Catalan structures, you also sometimes see the light squared bishops get traded, and on paper that favors black. It weakens white's king, and obviously piece exchanges favor the side that's more cramped. But there we go, Robert. That doesn't tell the whole story because knights are incredibly good at chiseling their way into the opponent's weaknesses, especially in these close positions. And apart from that, I think Magnus is now fully ready to play e4. But will he? Yes, he will. There he goes.
There he goes. He can play f4 as well, just start throwing up all of his kingside pawns. And one thing to note here is this should be reminiscent of the previous game, where there was a dark square bishop that couldn't really make an impact against some knights. Now, that bishop can take the knight on c3, but there's a huge problem. You play bishop c3, white plays pawn takes c3, the b file is open, rook b1, rook b3, rook other to b1, hitting the b7 pawn. So pawn chains are only as strong as their base pawns. The b7 pawn is safe and sound as long as that file remains closed.
And Hikaru bringing his queen into b6 and putting pressure on the pawn on d4. He is going to follow up with rook a to d8. And it concerns me that black's play in this position just seems very easy. It's free-flowing, rook d8. Then perhaps you can bring the knight back to d7 to exchange white's strongest piece. On the other hand, what is Magnus's plan? He doesn't seem remotely capable of pushing d5 here. I don't think that's the way he should go. Maybe he should bring his knight back to f3 and play e5. Robert, do you think he's just going to tread water with some of these improving moves?
For now, he will. And it's often what it requires in this kind of position. Knight f3, you mentioned it. He retreats, he defends. e4 to e5 is something to keep in mind. You don't want to rush that decision.
No.
Because as soon as you play e5, you give the d5 square and your pawn on d4 is a long-term weakness. That said, you vacate the e4 square for your knight. So what white sometimes does here is pawn h4. After e5, pawn g4, and start an attack on the king side, because look at black's pieces. Bishop on b4, queen on b6, rook on d7. They're playing on the other side of the board, so if you can get a timely attack, you may devastate, obliterate the black king.
A lot of players, a lot of fans, they think of these positions as boring, but they're not. It's a slow burn for sure, right? Nothing happens fast in these types of positions, not even the moves played by the players themselves, but there's so much going on behind the surface. There's so much tension on the board. Look at the pressure the black exerts on d4. Look at the potential that white has on the king side. Something's going to happen here, and it's only a matter of time. But I'm on the same page. You should not play e5 until careful consideration, because as a very wise man once said, pawn chains are only as strong as their base pawn.
Certainly the case. The knight on f3 doing a good job of defending d4, but as soon as that pawn goes up to e5, black will try to strike with c6 to c5 at the right moment, undermining the center. So queen c2. Let's keep everything defended. But where to next, Danya? Is queen b3 an option? I mean, where is that queen going?
I have no answer for you. Queen b3, where is it going from there? And a big decision by Hikaru as he takes on c3 and immediately follows up with a center strike. Help me make sense of this.
I mean, I like the b5 square for white now. He goes knight to e5, then knight can go to c4, take control of the light squares. But if the knight goes to c4, black has queen c6, putting pressure on the e4 pawn. So maybe white needs to play for f3 at some point, but for the moment, the d4 pawn is loose. Look at all the pressure Hikaru's pieces are exerting on white's center.
The knight's attacking e4, the queen's attacking d4. Knight c4 is played. What is Magnus planning on queen c6? I think it is your move f3, and it may seem to blunder due to c takes d4, but remember, after white recaptures, the knight on c4 is then defended. Hikaru goes the other way, queen to a6, chasing the knight away, but it re-centralizes to e3, and I think the trend of the game is, by a slight margin, starting to favor Magnus here.
And I thought he was going knight a3 to b5. Like that b5 square was an outpost for his knight. Instead, he centralized. You can't really blame somebody for keeping their pieces in the center of the board, but that b5 square was juicy because it also defended the d4 pawn. So knight e3, and we're past that point for now. And as I look at this position, Danya, I'm thinking, do I start pushing my pawns? Is e5 on the agenda? I don't love it because it allows the black knight to slide into d5 again, but I'm just trying to figure out what Magnus has in store for Hikaru after Hikaru starts trading pawns.
Well, if it was Magnus's move on the previous position, he would have played d5 and then cemented that pawn with c4. I think that's a big reason why Hikaru has traded on d4. Now, the move d5, it's still possible. It may still happen, but it loses a lot of its luster because after the exchange, that passed pawn, it's all alone, and passed pawns in the middle game can be a serious liability.
It's true, though. That knight would love to jump to f5 eventually. So if you do trade off the pawn on e6, you get clearance for the knight to land on f5. That's something to keep in the back of our minds. But Danya, right now, Hikaru done a full minute on the clock. I was about to say it. Once again, partner, you're reading my mind. Can Hikaru strike with b5? Because right now that pawn is a backwards pawn. And if you play rook b1, you stop that pawn in its tracks. Now, Hikaru is saying, I've defended b7. I'm going to go after the d file. And he does just that. But Magnus claiming that he's safe and sound pushing for a passed pawn.
Well, he's going to have to reinforce this pawn because Hikaru is actually threatening. I'm busy counting the attackers and defenders, but I think he is threatening to capture 4 or 5, however many times on d5. And see, the problem for the last couple moves for Magnus has been that the queen is kind of pegged to the e4 pawn. If you carelessly play queen b3, that move may actually work out tactically because after knight takes e4, there's d takes e6 and maybe e takes f7 check, but that has to be carefully calculated by Carlsen, and he slides his queen instead back toward b1 using the back rank to defend the pawn indirectly. What a move. And stops b5.
It's defense by attack. The h7 square is covered. So if we swap everything on d5...
I'll show this.
Let's show it because it's very instructive. The white rook lands on the c8 square with not just check, but checkmate because the h7 square is covered by that white queen. That would be mate. That's why Hikaru, he took on d5 once, but he is not going to keep capturing.
Back to the live board we go. He has indeed taken on d5. Magnus not rushing to recapture. I would have assumed that he could pre-move e takes d5. Maybe he's thinking about starting with knight takes d5, weighing the pros and cons of keeping the knights on the board versus taking them off the board. And because of the prospect of knight f5, he decides to keep them on the board. But Robert, now knight takes d5, that threat has been renewed.
It has been, but the dark squares are compromised. So if this queen slides up to b2 at some point, watch out because it does right now. Slicing across the board. The same back rank problem exists. If you take on d5, we swap everything. Rook c8, and as you're pointing out, rook or queen to h8 will be checkmate. Look at the queen on b2. It covers the entire length of the diagonal. This spells trouble for Hikaru, who simply slides his rook up at Danya. Maybe white can do the same, bringing the rook up on the d file.
He can, and you mentioned it, a slightly different defensive mechanism, but the same result. The pawn on d5 was untouchable, and Magnus continuing to tighten the screws. This is where he is best, as he tightens the noose from all sides. The rook moves up to c5. It can slide over to b5, and this is right around where Hikaru is seriously regretting not pushing b5 when he had a chance.
And you said all sides. I'm also looking at the clock. That may not be on the board, but it's definitely on Hikaru's mind. 22 seconds to over a minute. He goes queen a7, attacking the rook. The rook can simply slide over to b5. White can also make the move queen to c3, but you have to watch out because there's knight e4 with a fork. So watch out for these jumpy knights. You do not want to blunder here if you're Magnus Carlsen.
And queen a7 is a classic Hikaru move. This is what he does. He poses problems. He forces you to make decisions. And before you know it, he's dragged you into another time scramble. Rook to d to c1 by Magnus, the eval bar disapproving. b6, and Hikaru's going to go after the pawn with queen a8, but rook c6. I was expecting rook c7.
Okay, so knight d5, rook takes d6, knight takes e3 is check intermezzo, but the
there's
same
queen a8.
Back rank problem. He goes queen a8. Wow, what a move, because of rook d6, d5 will fall.
Oh my goodness, and if it falls, why can it end up a pawn down?
Maybe queen takes f6 here is a good practical try. But you give up your queen for a rook and a knight after queen takes f6. I'm just thinking about this because the b6 pawn is also loose.
And Robert, another detail. Queen e5, knight takes d5. Seems to blunder a rook, but knight takes e3 is a double check against White's king, and White's the one who gets mated. And look at this. Look at this. Magnus down to 15 seconds. We've got another time scramble, and Hikaru is once again in his comfort zone.
Yeah, Max needs to move. He's still thinking. He could sack the queen. He could take b6, but d5 will fall if he doesn't move that knight off the board. So the pawn is gone. The rook is protected on c6.
Rook G6
but that king is in
perpetual.
some trouble. He goes h4 instead. He wants to win.
He wants to win, but he's down to 4 seconds. We've seen this story unfold before. It's an equal position objectively, but both sides making threats. Magnus down to 1 second.
The rook can't move from d5. The f7 pawn is loose. The queen hits the rook. Queen lines up with rook on f7. Watch out. The second rook for white can come into the game.
It can come in the game through c4. There goes black's rook. Hikaru offering a queen trade, and that's basically a peace offering by Nakamura.
Well, white and black both have one active and one passive rook, but white's passive rook on f4 is still more active. There's nothing to attack.